there's going to be layers of challenges. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and please extend our thanks to the staff as well. Thank you. Item 10 is the revised American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and Local Recovery Fund budget. Administrator Lesher.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. What you have before you are the final modifications or transfers proposed with the ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds. As you know, the county has received a little over $203 million in ARPA funds. We began with a plan to the board in 2021, and we have made some modifications along the way to ensure that we are appropriately spending those dollars. Of the $203 million, you now have before you the final allocation or request to transfer about $1.3 million in order to ensure that we have expended the funds. We've got to purpose the funds by the end of this year and spend soon thereafter. And so I, first of all, would commend staff at keeping an eye on these dollars as we've moved along to go from $203 million to the request for this last $1.3 million to be formally and fully allocated. But that is the request you have before you. We do have some slides to walk through.
Thanks.
Mr. Holmes, thank you.
Chair Grijalva, members of the board. Just quickly, much of what Administrator Lesher highlighted already as a summary of really this presentation. What was before you today is a request for the end of our obligation period, spending obligation period, right? So it's December of 24 where we have to obligate all the dollars. That really is the purpose of today, to make sure that we're obligating funds and not making any other changes afterwards, because we cannot come back to you and make any other changes. So we did our best to look at what those spend down plans are, and more importantly, where we believe we can spend those down. There, I will point to, quite frankly, if you go to the last slide, please, Nico. It's the timeline recap at the very end. The very last slide. That was it.
One too far. There you go.
The reason this is important is
I do like the graphic.
This is really critical, because some of the concerns have been why December of 24. The actual spend down period ends in 26. However, we need to obligate dollars prior to that, and more importantly, the 6/30 of 25 is the last time we can actually use these funds for staffing. And so our interpretation of the obligation was, particularly the budget that was set this year for staffing, is the obligation requirements that we felt would meet the federal requirements for spend downs for staffing. So that's why today is super important. For other projects that are going to go beyond that timeline, but any staffing, internal staffing associated with this spending down plan, more importantly, the obligation period ends on 6/30 of 25. Therefore, you see some of those moving pieces today. A lot of that 1.3, again, given the amount of funding, there are small buckets that you see. They're just areas by which we felt that we're not going to get spend down, and then some overages that we wanted to reobligate those dollars. But I won't read we sent a pretty extensive memo along with those individual items to you all, and if there's any questions. If not, I'd ask for approval of this final modification.
Well, I just want to make a comment. The savings that PD&C have seen in Northwest Center and Curly, that's pretty amazing. So congratulations on that. And also that the fact that everything else with the project is on track. I'll go ahead and move the item.
Second.
I have a motion, a second by Supervisor Scott. Discussion. Supervisor Lee, then Supervisor Scott.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. This question, Administrator Lesher, is really for Mr. DeBonis, and it has to do with the Curly School, which is in my district, obviously in Ajo, and the community there is very excited about having that. And I think I've mentioned before, I see this when the electricity goes out in Ajo. This could be a respite area that will be air conditioned and have a generator. I just want to make sure that, because I always am asking, I know that we hadn't purchased the generator and it's going to be very costly because it's a huge building. Where are we with that? And the money, obviously the savings there, the 33,000 isn't going to buy a generator, but can you give an update on that?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Lee, I'm confident to assure you that a generator will be installed at that location. So the team is working on that. I haven't had a recent update from them on the process, but I know that funds are available within the project, and the plan is to size that appropriately to serve the needs of the community in instances of power outages. We'll get additional detail back to you on that.
Oh, thank you. And I'm just so excited. And thanks to all of those staff, and also Steve, thanks to the maintenance and Tony and his group that have done a lot of work in the Ajo court to make sure that that generator gets implemented. So thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Scott.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Holmes, for your presentation. And thank you, Ms. Lesher, for the memo that was given to us prior to discussion of this item. Just wanted to draw everybody's attention to table number 2 in the memo, and the last item addressed the Drexel property. Support Drexel shelter property maintenance. The ongoing extensive use of this property has caused the need to prioritize maintenance needs to preserve the county's investment and to ensure its long-term viability. I don't know if this is something that you're able to comment on right now, but if the board could get some report on what are some potential long-term options for use of the Drexel property. Again, I don't necessarily need that today, but just would like to know what are some options that we're looking into long-term. Thank you, Ms. Lesher.
Any other? Supervisor Christy.
Yeah. One question I do have is that this has to be spent, the remainder has to be spent by December 31st, 2026. A new administration is coming in January 20th. How can funds be obligated to that extent, almost a year past the beginning of a new administration?
Administrator Lesher.
Chair Grijalva and Supervisor Christy, this has all been federal law, and all of these dollars and the timelines are part of a federal law. And so to make modifications in this will require, additional legislation that could be passed and approved by the president. Could they claw back dollars? It is possible. We're watching that. But at this point, we believe it's not only federal action, presidential action, or executive branch action, but legislation that has been passed by both the House, Senate, and approved by the president.
Well,
and it began, I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, I do think it's imperative that it be noted that there could be, as you say, requires legislative action. That could very well happen within that year. So a lot of these obligations, I understand from many in county administration and my colleagues, that there's this rush to spend this money to make sure it gets spent before anything can happen to it with the new administration coming in. That's one area. The second area, I'm always astounded by the fact that these are all under quote unquote COVID dollars, and they're going to things that you wonder, what has this got to do with COVID? And that seems to be the overriding issue here is COVID is over. Why are we spending money that really has nothing to do with COVID just for the sake of spending money? And then I particularly hear that we've got to spend it because we have staff we have to pay. And the worst thing that can happen, I think, is the smartest. Send back the unspent money. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that these projects are not only happening here in Pima County, but all across the nation. So trying to make a big shift and pivot with these funds that have already been expended and we were told that we could use through 2026, I think will be complicated. Nothing impossible, I suppose, but I think it would be very complicated. Administrator Lesher.
Chair Grijalva, just note that while these are the Recovery Act dollars, which means it was not only responding to the public health needs during a pandemic, but to assist with the recovery going on in communities. So you'll see some dollars expended for economic development efforts or things that might be part of a recovery in the community. We are also somewhat optimistic that if you remember before ARPA, we had the CARES Act, which was the beginning of significant jeepers, millions that came to Pima County in the initial days of the pandemic that were in the previous Trump administration. So we're hoping to be able to align some of those dollars as well into the new administration.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so